a very rich and textured kind of portrait of the life of her.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And very explicitly
How do I get rid of my...
Initially that was sort of
We would
Right. Okie dokie.
Persist because of the Christian church. Get rid of the Christian church and it will stop. What's the answer? More Christians or
Oh, oh, God.
I don't know who it is I'm waving to. No idea.
My glasses.
I'm wondering if I could chase up this cataract thing, but I don't think I can.
Don't quite know where to chase it.
No, exactly. And it's no good phoning the clinic because they've done what they
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
Screen.
Michael, you may wish to mute your microphone
Good idea.
because we can hear you yawning.
Well, good evening, Haxamer. Good evening to our online audience, both on Zoom and on various liberal Judaism and the liberal synagogue Elstree platforms. So lovely to have you all here and online joining our discussion on the theme of anti-Semitism. Why does it persist? But we'll start topically with the blessings for Hanukkah candles.
I'm sorry, Rabbi, could I ask you to do it from the microphone? I'm so sorry. Keep on between one. Or just swing that one round.
Here you go.
Thank you.
Now say all that again.
All I was doing is just schmoozing you all and our online audience as well. So hello, good evening, Chag Sameach, and we start with Hanukkah candles. It's the 5th night tonight, exciting. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu le'adlik ner shel Chanukah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. אמן. הנרות הללו אנחנו מדליקים, הנרות הללו אנחנו מדליקים, על הניסים ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות שעשית לאבותינו, שעשית לאבותינו, שעשית לאבותינו, בימים ההם, בימים ההם, בימים ההם, בזמן הזה. We kindle these lights in remembrance of the wonderful deliverance you performed for our ancestors. During all the 8 days of Hanukkah, these lights are sacred. We're enjoined not to use them, but only to gaze upon them, so that their glow may move us to give thanks for your wonderful acts of deliverance. Ma'osur Yeshuati lechana el shabeach תיקון בית תפילתי ושם תודה נזבח לתשבית מטבח וצרה מנבח אז אגמור בשיר מזמור חנוכה דמזבח אז אגמור בשיר מזמור Chanukah damizbeach. Chag Sameach, happy Hanukkah. And I would like to start our evening with a welcome to all the participants of our panel. Thank you so much for coming here all the way to Elstree, Boreham Wood, long way, and being with us this evening. And thank you very much to our audience here tonight, as well as our Zoom and online audience for joining us this evening for this very important conversations during the night of Hanukkah. I love Hanukkah. Do you? The warmth and joy of Hanukkah lies in the long winter nights. Lovely celebrations during the 8 days with friends, community, and most importantly, with my family and my son. I don't know about you, but I love latkes. By the end of Hanukkah, I can neither look nor eat any more latkes until next year. What I never have enough of is the feeling of freedom, of religious freedom. First of all, I have here in the UK to celebrate the miracle of the Festival of Lights. Being born in Belarus during the Soviet Union, I can never take my religious freedom for granted. Only when I moved here to the UK almost 17 years ago did I feel safe as a Jewish person. Not because I feared for my life, but because I didn't need to feel ashamed of being Jewish anymore, and because I felt safe here. So it is with deep sadness I have been watching the rise of anti-Semitism in the recent years, and particularly in the Labour Party under the previous leader. It is with great sadness I had to deal with some anti-Semitic incidents and bullying of our children both at school and online while I was the rabbi in Nottingham. It is with great sadness I have learned from Councillor Dan Ozarov, member of our community, the Liberal Synagogue Elstree, that he and his family suffered horrific anti-Semitic abuse from some members of the Conservative Party last year when he stood as a council candidate. I was anxious to learn about a recent spate of anti-Semitic incident in our town, Bournemouth. Red swastika on benches, propaganda from patriotic alternatives, and mezuzah desecrations. My home does not feel safe anymore. But why? What have I done to be hated? What have the members of my community done? What have our children done to be the subject of such groundless hatred? I know we don't deserve it, and I know we will stand up to it. Being bullied at school, and on occasion standing there in the middle of the classroom on my own, taught me a lesson for the rest of my life. The lesson is to stand up for other people who are out there, standing on their own and facing groundless prejudice, hatred, and abuse. It is understandable to have a fear of the other, as philosophers Emmanuel Levinas and Martin Buber and others define it. The other is someone who is not part of our group, who is different, and therefore can potentially present a threat. But cooperation and not confrontation can save the world. We know that. Friendship is what builds bridges between different others and confronts prejudice and groundless hatred. Understanding and compassion is what bring peace. That's why interfaith is my passion. God created only one man at the beginning of creation, so to teach us a lesson that we all, people of faith and no faith, are connected to and with each other. Current levels of pollution and waste are not the only problem we have to face together. Racism and eradication of it in our society is another problem we can and have to address together. It is not God's responsibility to look after us and our planet. It is our responsibility. It is not God's responsibility to bring peace upon our planet. It is our responsibility to work for peace and face problems together. Therefore, I am delighted to introduce to you our interfaith panel tonight, talking about and addressing one strand of modern racism, anti-Semitism. And I will start with our co-chairs, Bezana Shan and Imogen Resnick. Bezana Shan is from Nottingham, a vice chair of HEMA, a social action group, a vice chair of HEMA, a social action, Muslim social action group, a member of Salam Shalom Kitchen Steering Group, which is a joint Jewish-Muslim charity, and a senior leaders development advisor within policing. And Imogen Resnick is a trustee of Kehillah North London, and she grew up in Nottingham. She organizes with the Jewish left in London and holds a master's degree in modern Middle Eastern studies from Oxford University. I guess the theme tonight is going to be from Nottingham. You can see I brought all the mafia from Nottingham together with me, Nottingham Mafia. Susanna and Imogen, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And now I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for those of you who are here at the synagogue and those who are watching via Zoom and a live stream. I'm really pleased and feel really privileged to be co-chairing such an event. I think they are so few and far between. We need more of them. So I feel really touched that the Rabbi asked me to do this. So this is the first time I'm doing something like this and with such great speakers. So I'll introduce the first speaker to my left, which is the Reverend Bruce Thompson. He's the author of Echoes of Contempt. It's a history of Judeophobia and the church. Reverend Bruce is a blogger and a broadcaster, as well as a church leader. He's a prominent voice in challenging the Christian church and its hostilities towards Jews over the centuries, including the present day. He's also very, very passionate about interfaith. We met on many occasions through these interfaith events. He's a friend of various Muslim associations and Christian and Jewish organizations. He's a Methodist minister for nearly 40 years. He's chair of the Lincolnshire Methodist District, which includes 130 churches and 30 ministers. He's married to Karen. He has 2 grown-up adult boys. His best friend is his dog. We've interacted a number of times. Once, I think, possibly the first time would have been at the synagogue, the Liberal synagogue in Nottingham. It was an interfaith domestic abuse event. And later then we were on a podcast together with Rabbi Tanya. I think it was the Jewish podcast. I don't remember the exact name. And we were speaking on issues of interfaith. And then recently, Reverend Bruce asked me to come and speak at Synod to around 30 ministers on what seemed to me was their development day. And I sort of had my input on that session as well. So literally for me, a man who practices what he preaches. So I'd like to hand over to you, Bruce, for a few words.
Thank you. Thank you, Fazana. And thank you, Rabbi Tanya, for the invitation, and Chairman Michael for your welcome tonight to this shul. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's lovely to see people who are physically present, and that helps enormously with the interaction and sense of engagement and dialogue. But also it's really good to know that there are people watching online or on Zoom, and understandably so at this time with increasing anxiety regarding COVID and the way in which we've learned to adapt in these recent times. Rabbi Tanya has asked me to give a kind of introduction as to why it is that I'm passionately engaged in challenging the Christian church on anti-Semitism, which is a sort of term I'd like to unpack at some point, because I don't think it isn't quite accurate to suggest that it's solely anti-Semitism, because it runs very deep in Christian theology and Christian practice to be hostility towards Jews, not on a basis of race, but also particularly on the basis of religion. So we'll probably have opportunity, I hope, in the next 10 minutes or towards the end of those 10 minutes to begin to unpack that. But to explain why it is that I am so engaged in challenging the Christian church in anti-Semitism, or Judeophobia, as I prefer to call it in my book, I have to go right back 50 years, actually, because my first recognition that there was hostility came in 1972. In 1970, as a 10-year-old, I'd watched the Mexico World Cup All of you too young to remember the Mexico World Cup of 1970. But I had to go down to the Working Men's Club in order to watch it in colour because we couldn't afford a colour TV. But I was very keen sports person. And so by 1972, my parents had saved up and bought a colour TV so we could watch the Olympics in glorious Technicolor. And those of you who were around anyway, but I'm sure you all know that the 72 Olympics in Munich became infamous because of the Black September hostage taking of Israeli Olympians and the eventual killing of those Olympians. And as a 12-year-old, I was absolutely horrified that someone could go to a premier sports event to take part, the pinnacle of their career as sportsmen and women, and find themselves targeted by terrorists and lose their lives as a consequence, simply because they were Israelis, simply because they were Jews. And I was growing up in a very monocultural community, in a mining community in Staffordshire, where really the only difference was whether you were a Protestant or a Catholic. That was the sum total of it. It all depended where you lived in the town and which school you went to. But to suddenly become aware that there was this hostility at the age of 12 was extraordinary. And then, of course, 12 months later was the Yom Kippur War. And as a 13-year-old who'd been fascinated by the Second World War, my grandfather was a Royal Marine in the Second World War, didn't say much about it, but that sort of silence, that mystery, increased my interest. And so I watched with incredulity these armies surrounding Israel and trying to extinguish it. Now, that's the basis, because I began to consider what was going on in this world. And then over the years, I became obviously aware of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and then as a Methodist minister in the late 90s in Manchester, I encountered people from the Jewish community more than I'd ever done before. And I met a man called Maurice Brunner, who always carried with him his Council of Christians and Jews application form. And every time I saw him at events, or whenever I saw him around and about, he'd give me an application form because I'd never filled one in. No, I haven't had a chance, Maurice, blah, blah, blah. And then one day, I saw him in the hospital car park. And I was the first person he told. He'd just come from a consultation. I was the first person he told. He hadn't even told his wife. We didn't have mobile phones in 98, 97. And I was the first person he told that he'd just had bad news and he was terminally ill. And I carried on visiting Maurice in hospital till his last. And when he died, I took out one of the CCJ forms and filled it in and sent it off. And it was through CCJ, the Council of Christians and Jews, that I became more and more involved in a local shul and attended the rabbi's shul study evenings every Monday evening. And I encountered Holocaust survivors, and I heard for the first time someone say that John's account of the gospel was anti-Semitic. And there I was, a Methodist minister, ordained as a Methodist minister. I'd travelled through Sunday school, church, youth fellowship, theological college, and here I was for the first time hearing that one of the Christian books, one of the Christian Gospels was anti-Semitic. So I went home and read it again with fresh eyes, coming from a new perspective, and realised that within John's account of the Gospel, there are many anti-Jewish verses, much anti-Jewish sentiment. And this became completely new to me. And it was only then that I began to really dig much deeper into our Christian theology and into our Christian teaching and discover the kind of practice, the contempt that had been prevalent throughout the history of the Christian church. Right from the very early church, as the gap between the Jewish Christians, those Jews who were following Jesus, and those who were not following Jesus, began to deepen after the fall of the temple. And then in subsequent centuries, the teachings of the early fathers were very hostile. By the medieval period, that hostility grew into huge sort of massacres and keeping the Jewish communities down. I learned, for example, that during the Crusades, senior church leaders grew very concerned about the massacre of Jews as the Crusaders headed towards the Holy Land. Not because they felt compassion. Oh no, they asked the Crusaders to actually be more restrained, not because they were compassionate towards them, but because they were fearful that the Jewish community would die out. And again, not because of compassion, but because the Christian church believed it necessary to have a Jewish community to which they could point and say, look what happens when God turns against people. To keep them impoverished, to keep them oppressed, and say, this is what would happen if you turn against God. And that was the reason why some of the Jewish communities of Europe were preserved by Christian leaders during that time. And I became horrified by that. I read about Luther's, sort of a pamphlet on Jews, and it was just horrendous. I would describe it, and I describe it in my book, as a blueprint for the Shoah. I won't read it now, time is running out. But there are the points that, you could almost follow. And lo and behold, it wasn't a kind of overlooked by the Nazis in 1933 that it was a special anniversary of Luther's birth. And so for the first time in decades, that pamphlet was republished in 1933. And I would argue that pamphlet, The Jews and Their Lies, according to Luther, probably had as much impact on Christian communities in Germany, the Lutheran communities in Germany, as Mein Kampf did. Because, of course, they're looking towards their founder of their faith, their denomination, and they're reading what he had to say about Jews. Horrendous stuff. Luther had hoped that by being opposed to Rome, Jewish communities might come to his side and realize they had a common enemy. And it was only when he realized that Jews were not going to come converted on their knees, begging for inclusion in the Lutheran Church, that Luther turned against them. And boy, did he turn against them. And as I say, to read The Jews and Their Lies by Luther is like reading a blueprint to the Shoah. I came to understand that the Shoah wasn't just catastrophe, as it may be translated, a catastrophe for the Jewish communities. It became a blot on the Christian church, an indelible stain to which we must look and address and recognize that so much of the anti-Semitism that has come down to us through the centuries and remains present to this day is partly there as a consequence of Christian teaching and a failure to actually grasp what was being written in the early stages and why, because we hadn't contextualized it enough. We didn't understand the breakdown in the two communities. And so it has come to us from generation to generation. I believe there's so much been done in recent years since the Holocaust to actually begin bridging the gap, to actually reach out again and engage in dialogue. And there are more and more people coming forward to say so. However, maybe we'll address some of the things in the questions. We haven't got much time, but I hope and pray that we have sufficient people to challenge the rise in the new anti-Semitism, even though it's a tough place to be at this moment in time. I do think there is still hope for us. And boy, oh boy, it's so good to be in a shul and to engage in cross-community dialogue. So I must shut up. I've been told no more than 15 minutes, and I can see I've had 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Really great words there, and a lot of what you've said. I'm just listening, and yes, the incident you've mentioned about the athletes or Yom Kippur, is possibly before my time, and I'm not. This is the first time I'm hearing about it, but that says a lot, doesn't it? A lot of times, the only thing we hear is the Holocaust. Now, for athletes to be snatched, kidnapped, and then killed, isn't that something we should hear about to know that that actually happened? I don't know about that. I've just learned that. That's anti-Semitism, right there. And just based on what you're saying, recently, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, I went to Malta. And because I'm a bit more enlightened now about Judeophobia, anti-Semitism, because of Salam Shalom Kitchen, and I have a lot of Jewish friends now, and Rabbi Tanya, of course. And she bought me this book. She gifted me a book. Forgot the name of the author, you know.
David Baddiel?
Yeah, Jews Don't Count. And I learned a lot from there, a lot from that book. So we're in Malta with my daughter, and we took the bus tours. And this is something that I came back and mentioned to my family and my children. And I was like mumbling away on the hop on, hop off bus tour. And those who know of Malta, there's a huge history of the Order of St. John and, you know, and the World War II. But so we're going around, and I'm a real big, you know, fan of history. So as the bus goes around, it says everything, and then it just drops a little comment about the ancient cemeteries and the catacombs and the old, or maybe ancient, they said, but Jewish cemetery. Then it went on, and you know, we took several tours because there was just me and my one daughter with me. And I said to her, we saw not a single synagogue. There was no further mention of the history of the Jewish people who lived on that island. We didn't know, were they wiped out? You know, I don't know much about the Order of St. John and the Crusades and what happened in Malta, but it really touched me. I was like really hurt and I was angry. I thought, could they not have mentioned more about the Jewish community that is there possibly now? I don't know if there's a Jewish community. I don't know the history of the Jewish community. The fact that they mentioned there was this old cemetery was enough for me to be triggered then to think, and so this is, you know, and I learned that from, you know, Jews Don't Count. It's like, who's not at the table, who's not mentioned? They weren't mentioned. And this is why we're here. So it was enough for me to be like, right, I don't want to be listening to this. This is a bit one-sided. So those of you who are watching us and joining us on Zoom, and those who are watching us on live stream, please put your questions in the chat, and I'll endeavour to put those questions on your behalf to Reverend Bruce. I have a few questions here. Are you happy for me to make a start?
Yep, absolutely.
Great. Right, we'll go with the first one. Do you think the church overlooks anti-Semitism when it addresses issues of racism in general?
I think what we need to remember is the Christian church, like every religious community and every organization, is made up of human beings. And today we are exposed to social media that is drip feeding what it wants to drip feed. And algorithms are having a greater impact. I don't know if anybody's listened to the Wreath lectures on BBC. The one yesterday, the first of the Wreath lectures yesterday, was on algorithms and artificial intelligence. And there was one phrase there which really captured my imagination, and that was the cognitive intake for people today through social media is having a greater impact upon them than any dictator has ever done. So the Christian church, like any organization, is made up of human beings, and they are exposed to this kind of mantra of what we should be interested in, what we should be concerned about. And sure enough, the anti-Semitism that is on the rise today is often denied by many people or underestimated. And in the sense that the Christian church is part of this society, I would have to say, yes, right across society, of which the Christian church is a part, underestimates the impact of anti-Semitism. We have to remember, as Tony Blair said in the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 2005, that the Shoah did not begin with gas chambers, but with broken windows and boycotts. And people trot out boycotts on the tip of their tongue. You know, it's okay to boycott this, it's okay, without a full understanding of the consequences and the way in which this can then lead step by step by step to greater hostility towards Jewish communities. Broken windows, swastikas on shop windows, and so it has to be checked. And if the church and society doesn't check that, whilst taking into consideration other forms of prejudice, then it will be complicit, as it was complicit in the 1930s. It became a horrific fact to me when I discovered that I, a Methodist minister, discovered that the Methodist Church in Germany was very pro-Nazi for all sorts of reasons. And there were very few people who stood up to the regime and stood up to those expressions of anti-Semitism in the early days. And I think we are at the cusp of something very dangerous if we don't stand up and be counted at this present moment.
Thank you. Are we ready for another question?
Yes, if we have time, yes.
All right. Quick one. How can the church, but a very deep one, how can the church meaningfully repent for its sins against Jews in the past?
How can the church meaningfully repent for its contempt or hostility towards Jews in the past?
Yeah.
This is a great question, isn't it? What can the Christian church do in order to repent? Franklin Littell, having sort of castigated the German Methodists, let me say that Franklin Littell was an American Methodist whose parents were German, and in 1938 went to a Nuremberg rally from America in order to see what was going on. And actually, there's a wonderful photograph, if you Google him, Franklin Littell at Nuremberg, remonstrating with a Nazi stormtrooper, and he gets kicked out. And at the end of the war, he goes back to Germany as part of the denazification program, and eventually becomes the leading academic in the United States on Holocaust and anti-Semitism and the way in which Christian contempt towards Jews. So, having painted that negative picture of German Methodism, there were others who did amazing things. And Franklin Littell said this: the Christian church can never reach its full potential or fulfill the mission to which it was called until it repents with regards to its relationship to Judaism. In other words, until we acknowledge that 6 million Jews were rounded up, transported, selected, and killed by, in the main, baptized Christians, we'll never really be free from this stain that is indelible upon the Christian church. How can we deal with it today? Well, it's a little known fact that in the light of the Colson statue being removed in Bristol, and the Christian churches up and down the country asking questions about its links with the slave trade, and were there benefactors and statues and so on for slave owners and so on and so forth. The Christian church, the Church of England in particular, because it has the ancient monuments, of course, the cathedrals and the minsters, is actually engaged in looking at anti-Semitic imagery in those buildings. So in Lincoln, where I live, the cathedral there has asked me to be a part of a committee to look at the anti-Semitic stained glass and some of the carvings that are present in that building, and to actually address, you could take them all down, but what do you learn from it then? Nothing. On the other hand, if you leave them there and then have a proper explanation of what was going on and say, we regret this, as indeed they did in 2008 or 9 with the tomb of Little Hugh. Some of you may have heard of Little Hugh, a blood libel victim in Lincoln, one of the most famous blood libel victims, and the tomb is still there, probably the only body of a blood libel victim person in the whole of Europe. Still there in the tomb. They excavated the body a couple of centuries ago, found not a mark on the body, despite the claim that he'd been crucified and his teeth knocked out. But alongside that tomb is a little explanation and the regret, the remorse of the church that this should have happened and has continued down the centuries. So I very much hope that we're in the process of addressing the historic contempt of Judaism that is found in Christianity. So I think we're on the way. We haven't done enough. Of course we haven't done enough, and we have to win it in every generation. I do believe that we have to win this in every generation. And I think one of the rises of anti-Semitism in recent times is as a consequence of the fact that we have forgotten the lessons of the Second World War and the lessons of the Shoah. We've moved more and more away from it, and that is deeply regrettable. But it's time. It's the passage of time. And we need to tell the story afresh and tell the stories of today, the way in which Rabbi Tanya and I were at JCOS today, and I asked the teacher about anti-Semitic incidents in the school, and it just went on. And I think when you don't live in a Jewish community such as when you live in places where Jewish communities don't exist, it's much harder to get the message across. It sounds in some people's minds fabricated and exaggerated. You and I know that it's not, and we need to get the message across. It's not exaggerated. It's not fabricated. It is real. Real human beings being oppressed. Those young people on the bus the other night on Oxford Street, did you see it? Absolutely horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. We need people to address that. Take it on board now. Don't appease it. Don't deny it. Take it on. That's what I would say. And that's for the Christian church as well.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. We've had a couple of questions, and I'll save them for the end of the evening. But right now, I'm going to pass on to Imogen. Is that okay?
Yeah, I was going to say, do you want to ask questions from the audience? Because we've still got 5 more minutes. Oh,
Have we?
Yeah.
Oh, we do want to, sorry, I'm getting conflicting messages.
I thought it was 8
That's all right.
o'clock.
Yeah,
Apologies, okay.
no worries.
Sure, I'm just going to get up Daniel's bio. So yeah, I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker, Daniel Randall, who's here on my right. We're both former members of the same shul in